Well, I woke up this morning and I said to myself, Sir, we should really do a show today. There's a lot going on. And so here we are. That's the context in which today's program is being produced. One programming note, dozens of people writing to me breathlessly. You could tell, even though it was written text, that people were breathless, saying, David, when is your Lex Friedman appearance coming out? I don't know the answer, but Lex said it would be 3 or 4 days from when we filmed it earlier this week. So I would guess by the end of this week, but I don't know, and I don't have any control over it. But I'm as eager to take a look at it as some of the other folks in the audience are. So we'll know about that very, very soon. All right, listen, I've been waiting for this, and it is now happening. Republicans, right wingers, MAGA types, Steven Crowder, and others are now coming after what we call no-fault divorce, which essentially translates to they want to force women to have to stay married unless they can give what some consider an acceptable reason for why they should be allowed to get divorced. What on earth am I talking about? Let's backtrack and let's set it up. I had no plan to talk about right-wing content creator Steven Crowder's divorce on the podcast. There's really just no reason to talk about it. I don't know. There's nothing particularly newsworthy about it, except when I watched his brief explanation of the personal trouble that he's having, and including this very contentious divorce. He seemed to sort of bemoan the fact that his wife can just say, hey, I want a divorce, and it's called no-fault divorce. You don't have to prove that someone cheated or whatever to justify the divorce. You're just allowed to say, I don't want to be in this marriage anymore. And in the video that Steven Crowder put out about this, he seemed to be sort of suggesting that that's a problem, that that's not okay. His wife maybe should be forced to stay married to him. And he's not the only one who feels this way. Let's take a listen. This is the video from, I guess now it's been about a week since this news broke, to the extent that it's news.
I have been living with a proverbial boot on my neck for going on years now. Since 2021, I've been living through what has increasingly been a horrendous divorce. Now, let me say on the outset, to be clear, there is no infidelity, any kind of physical abuse at all on either side. And no, this was not my choice. My then wife decided that she didn't want to be married anymore. And in the state of Texas, that is completely permitted.
It's permitted. It's allowed. As crazy as it is, you're just allowed to say, I don't want to be married anymore. And I can't control that. So this is now building into a bigger story. And there's a very interesting Rolling Stone article. The next front in the Republicans' war on women, no-fault divorce. Steven Crowder is part of a growing right-wing chorus calling for an end to modern divorce laws. And the article explains, and you can check it out, Steven Crowder is getting a divorce. He says it's not his choice. He says his wife is just allowed to do it. And the article says Crowder's emphasis on the state of Texas makes it sound like the Lone Star State is an outlier, but all 50 states and the District of Columbia have no-fault divorce laws on the books, laws that allow either party to walk away from an unhappy marriage without having to prove abuse, infidelity, or other misconduct. Republicans are now unsure whether this is something that they actually want. And the article goes on to say, like the crusades against abortion and contraception, making it more difficult to leave an unhappy marriage is about control. Crowder's home state could be the first to eliminate it if the Texas Republican Party gets its way. Last year, the Republican Party of Texas added language to its platform calling to an end to no-fault divorce. This is another way to potentially control women. That's what this is fundamentally about. No-fault divorce is a legal process, which basically just means you can end a marriage without having to prove that any spouse is at fault for the breakdown of the marriage. And the history of no-fault divorce in the United States goes back to the early 20th century, but it really wasn't until the 1970s that no-fault divorce had widespread acceptance. And before you had no-fault divorce, I sound like Trump. Many people don't know this. A lot of people have no reason to think about this. But before there was no fault divorce, divorce laws in the US were based on fault. And what that meant is, in order to be granted a divorce, in order to be allowed to get a divorce, one spouse had to prove that the other spouse was at fault for the failure of the marriage. And often it was adultery, cruelty, some kind of abandonment, like they basically left already anyway, sometimes insanity or what we might call mental illness. And then in the 60s and 70s, states started to rightfully reconsider that and say, hey, maybe people, in the same way that they can choose to get married, should just be allowed to choose to no longer be married anymore. And California was the first to pass no-fault divorce in 1969. And then by the end of the 1970s, most states had done the same thing. The really important thing to understand here, aside from what I believe to be the obvious logic that you shouldn't have to make a case to be allowed to get divorced, you should just be able to say, I don't want to be married anymore. It's worth mentioning that no-fault divorce significantly improved the lives of women as well as children in many situations by giving them greater legal protections and more equitable outcomes in divorce proceedings. Now, you'll have the men's rights activists who love to say men routinely and sort of systematically get screwed over when it comes to custody in divorce proceedings, and it's unfair and all these different things. I consider that to be a different issue that can be discussed on its merits. But understand that prior to the introduction of no-fault divorce, particularly because it was during an era where women were statistically less likely to work, or if they worked, they were statistically likely to be earning less money than the husband in a heterosexual marriage, they were more likely to be dramatically disadvantaged and controlled by the lack of no-fault divorce. And so no-fault divorce, as obvious as it is to many of us, and as standard as it is in so many other Western developed nations, it actually was a really significant change and liberating to some degree, providing additional rights to many women as it became more common during the 1970s. So it's not a surprise, given that Republicans love policy that allows women to be controlled. Let's control what women can do with their bodies. Let's control medically, et cetera. Given all of that, it's not a surprise that they found yet another issue on which they want to go back to the 1950s. And again, that's quite literally what we're talking about. This was the law of the land in the 1950s, started changing 69 into the 70s. I had an inkling when I saw the Crowder video, they're going to go after this no-fault divorce. And now that is in and of itself becoming a bigger story. Horrifying stuff, but it is the party, it is the movement of going back to the 1950s.